When you think of sleeping in the 1300s, your mind probably conjures images of peasants dozing in the hay or nobles reclining on fancy beds. And while those images aren't too far off, there's one detail that might raise an eyebrow. If you travel back to the 1300s and peeked into a peasant S-hut or a noble S-chamber at night, you'd notice something very odd. People weren't lying flat in bed. Instead, they were propped up, half sitting, half reclining, like they were waiting for tea and not sleep. This wasn't some medical emergency or furniture fail, it was normal. Why? Was it fear of dying in your sleep? Belief in demons sitting on your chest if you lay flat? Did everyone just have bad backs from farming all day? Well, it turns out the reasons were complicated. A mix of science, superstition, class, and very uncomfortable mattresses all played a role. Sleeping sitting up wasn't just a weird habit, it was deeply tied to how medieval people saw health, nighttime dangers, and even death itself. So let's start with the most popular theory for why medieval people slept while sitting up. What about those pesky demons? Medieval people did believe that demons sometimes sat on people's chests to keep them from breathing. And some folks thought these demons preferred sitting on flat chests, making nighttime deaths more likely. To avoid this fate, people slept while leaning against a wall or propped up on pillows. But demons weren't the only danger lurking in the dark. People also believed that poisonous snakes and spiders liked crawling into bed with warm, sleeping people. So, sleeping while sitting minimized the risk of creepy crawlies slithering in. You can even find advice in old books telling people to shake their bedding before getting in to make sure no creepy crawlies were sharing their bed. But fear of nighttime dangers wasn't the only reason for this strange sleeping habit. Back then, people didn't have fancy alarm clocks, so they relied on animals to wake them up before sunrise. Chickens were popular since they started clucking and flapping around before dawn, rousing their owners from sleep. But here's the problem. If you're sleeping while sitting, it's much easier to hear those chickens and get up right away. Plus, if you're already half sitting, you don't have to bother with stripping off clothes or tucking in a nightshirt, making getting up way faster. Time was money in the Middle Ages, so losing a few precious minutes to a quick trip to the privy or to tend to livestock was a big deal. But there was also a more high-tech reason for this odd sleeping habit. Back in the Middle Ages, people would hire someone to sit by their bedside at night, keeping them safe from robbers and other threats. But if you're lying flat in bed, it's harder to talk or signal to your guard. Sitting up made communication easier and also gave the guard something to do besides staring at the wall. They could chat with the person in bed or even read a book while keeping a lookout. Then there's the surprising fact that sitting up while sleeping was a habit mostly confined to the wealthy. That's because the super rich had fancy adjustable beds that could raise themselves, allowing the occupant to read or eat in bed or, watch TV. Okay, that last one is me being anachronistic. But the point is, these beds were highly prized, and the mechanics were often operated by a servant whose job it was to keep the bed raised during nighttime hours. Meanwhile, peasants didn't have fancy adjustable beds. In fact, their mattresses were usually made of straw and were so uncomfortable that sleeping while sitting up gave them better support. Not to mention that sitting up prevented the straw from poking through the holes in their rough linen sheets. So why did this strange sleeping habit die out after the Middle Ages? Well, for one thing, people stopped fearing demons, poisonous spiders, and nighttime bandits all that much. Then there's the fact that mattresses got better. During the Renaissance, feather mattresses became popular and people started sleeping on softer, more comfortable surfaces. Lying down finally became the norm. Now, if you want to learn more about one of the creepiest parts of medieval life, check out this video on medieval superstitions. Or click this other video instead. Now with your choice, I shall vanish. We do usually think of the Middle Ages as a time when people got a lot of sleep. Between plagues, wars, and, just general suckage. The period from roughly 476 to 1450 AD was pretty rough. But one thing that might surprise you is that people didn't sleep in very comfortable conditions either. Forget about silky smooth sheets and down comforters. We're gonna take you back to the basics of sleep. Hey there, welcome to my channel. First things first, the beds themselves. In the 1300s, most people weren't curling up on plush mattresses or feather pillows. If you were poor, your bed was probably a pile of straw in the corner of a drafty room, possibly shared with siblings, parents, goats, or chickens. Even the rich had beds that would make a modern camper wince. Wooden frames with rope lattice, lumpy wool-stuffed mattresses, and headboards that weren't exactly ergonomically designed. Now imagine lying flat on that. Your back would scream, your head would throb, and you'd be staring up into a smoky, soot-stained ceiling all night. Instead, people leaned back on mounds of pillows or bed bolsters, big, firm cushions, propping themselves up at an angle. It was the closest thing to comfort they had. For the wealthy, this was also a posture of elegance. You didn't lie flat like a corpse, you reclined like a living legend. And thus, even the furniture encouraged upright sleeping. But comfort wasn't the only reason. In the next part, we'll talk about the terrifying fears medieval people had of sleeping flat on their backs, especially when it came to demons and death. If you enjoyed this episode, click the link in the description to get comfy with our series. Medieval Life, new episodes premiere every Wednesday. As we mentioned in part 1, even if you were propped up on pillows, your mattress was still lumpy and hard. But your bed could be hiding another danger as well. In the Middle Ages, the floor was the best place for treasure, at least according to demons. See, those little monsters liked to sneak into bedrooms at night and roll around on people's beds, which not only made for some seriously uncomfortable sleep, but also caused people to bloat and sometimes even burst. Well, at least that's what people thought was happening. The real cause was a bacterial infection that killed people in their sleep and inflated their bodies with gas. Naturally, this led people to believe that the only way to avoid a demonic bloating was to sleep while sitting upright. So people developed special chairs specifically for sleeping, usually around the year 1300. These chairs were sturdy and wide enough to support the sleeper's arms and elbows, which were bent at right angles. The top of the chair was stuffed with straw or wool, and sometimes even feathers for the ultimate pillow. Sounds kind of regal, doesn't it? Maybe like something Marie Antoinette would have used before her, unfortunate demise. But these chairs were actually popular among the lower classes who were often too busy working during the day to get a full night's rest. By reclining in their chairs, they could catch a few winks while also keeping an eye out for pesky demons. The fear of nocturnal prowlers didn't end at the bedroom door. People were terrified of being attacked while they slept, whether by humans or hungry animals. In fact, a person's bed was considered so vulnerable that many families kept a lantern or a torch burning throughout the night to ward off attackers or any evil spirits that might creep in. Sometimes a dog or cat would brave the dangers of the night and curl up on the bed for warmth. But for the most part, people preferred to stay safe in a special piece of furniture called a coverlet, or in English, bed cover. This was basically a wooden box that slid over the top of your bed, turning it into kind of a coffin. When you needed to get out of bed, you'd open up the covers, revealing a trapdoor in the mattress that folded down. Then you could climb out, grab your clothes, and do your morning chores before anyone else was awake. Now it's time to hear from you. What did you find most surprising about medieval beds? Let us know in the comments below. And hey, thanks for watching. A little over 600 years ago, people started to get really creeped out about lying flat on their beds. And it wasn't because they were expecting a visit from the Queen of England, whose favorite pastime was apparently strapping people to their beds. They were scared of dying in their beds, or more accurately, being dead before they knew it. In the 1300s, most people in Europe died from the plague, war, or famine. But when death did come knocking at a time other than the dreaded 3, people were pretty terrified. You might think we're over the whole witchcraft and demons thing, but back then, evil spirits and the devil himself were just around the corner. Or rather, he was lurking in the shadows under your bed. Let's start at the beginning. When someone died, they were usually buried flat on their back with their arms crossed, looking as peaceful as possible. This was the default position for the dead, and it didn't do much to discourage the living from copying the pose. After all, there were plenty of perfectly healthy people walking around who looked like they'd just kicked the bucket. Sometimes the only difference was that they were breathing. In 1278, a writer named Albertus Magnus documented the danger of falling asleep face up. He wrote that a demon would sit on the chest of unsuspecting sleepers, causing them to stop breathing. Now, modern medicine recognizes this as sleep paralysis, a condition that can make you feel like there's a weight on your chest when you trying to fall asleep or just waking up. Sleep paralysis is harmless, but in the Middle Ages, it was a sign that the night hag had come to collect your soul. The night hag was a witch that sat on the chests of sleeping people, stealing their breath. She was the stuff of nightmares unless you woke up and realized she was still there. Waking up with the night hag on top of you was a terrifying experience. Victims could move their arms or legs, but they couldn't speak or scream. They just had to wait until the hag flew away. And as if one creepy old woman wasn't enough, there was also the specter or ghost of death, which would appear in your bedroom in the form of a gray, emaciated old man. The specter would stand at the foot of your bed and beckon with a finger for you to follow him. If you accepted his invitation, presumably by standing up and following him, you died. But it wasn't quite that simple. There were rules to avoid being whisked away by the spirit. For one, don't lie down in bed facing up. That's how the Grim Reaper knew you were ready to die. Instead, you should sleep in an upright position, preferably propped up against a wall, like you were sitting in a chair. These superstitions led people to develop some pretty elaborate sleeping arrangements. They stacked pillows on top of each other to prop themselves up or slept while seated in chairs or even crapped their beds, basically curling up into a fetal position. It seems kind of counterintuitive that these precautions would actually work, but sometimes they did. If people thought you were dead, they left you alone. And if you stayed still enough, well, no one would have been none the wiser. All those centuries of elaborate sleeping habits might seem a bit ridiculous today, but they make sense when you consider how terrifying death was in the Middle Ages. War, plague, and famine were always around the corner. At least death itself was predictable. One advantage to living in the 1300s is that you never had to worry about what to watch on Netflix. Because, of course, there was no Netflix. And with all the death, you kind of couldn't binge anything. Anyway, there were some benefits to this backwards thinking. Even though people thought the devil was hiding under their bed, it meant that they weren't casually lying on their backs with their mouths open, inviting trouble. Instead, they slept with their mouths open, breathing heavily, looking like they were in the middle of a snoring contest. Maybe those nights spent piling pillows up high and sleeping in odd positions saved some lives. We may never know the full story, but at least we can thank medieval health fads for giving us a good excuse to stay away from the bedroom floor. Now you need to watch. What if you were reincarnated in the Middle Ages? Or check out? This is what medieval torture was really like. You know what sucks about being alive in the 21st century? It's hard to think of anything more unbearable than waking up with a crick in your neck or back. No one wants to start their day that way. But if you really want to feel pain, try waking up in the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, doctors believed that the best position to sleep in was sitting up in bed. And we mean straight up. They advised patients to prop themselves up at a 45-degree angle, like you're about to give a TED Talk on the proper way to breathe. According to these so-called physicians, sleeping like that would help prevent demons from crawling into your mouth or worse, your backside. But even if you managed to avoid demonic possession, you still ran the risk of dying from an imbalance of fluids. Because medieval medicine was firmly entrenched in the theory of humors, which posited that your body was filled with 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the key to good health was to keep those fluids evenly distributed. If any one humor got out of whack, you'd get sick. And the 4 humors were constantly interacting and influencing each other. Black bile was produced by the brain and the heart and was connected to melancholy. Yellow bile was made by the liver and the spleen and was associated with anger. Phlegm came from the lungs and kidneys and was linked to the state of calm and tranquility. Finally, blood was produced by blood and was supposed to be, lively. If the balance of these humors was ever disrupted, the cure was to re-establish equilibrium, usually by removing some of the humor that was causing the problem. Too much phlegm, cough up some phlegm. Too much blood, bleed a little bit. This is why bloodletting was such a popular form of medical treatment during the Middle Ages, but the theory of humors also influenced how people slept. In the 1300s, doctors started warning their patients against lying flat at night because they believed it caused your bodily humors to pool dangerously in your head or chest. Sitting up slightly allowed the fluids to flow properly and reduced the risk of fevers, headaches, or worse. Your pillow was considered an important part of keeping your humors in check. And while today we might think of a nice soft pillow as a luxury, during the Middle Ages, the ideal pillow was hard and flat. That way your head wouldn't sink in and your neck would stay straight. Doctors even recommended putting something hard like a stone or metal under your head for support. As for your head covering, a simple linen or cotton pillowcase was the best. Anything fancy or made of animal skins could disrupt the balance of your humors. And if you were worried about your bottom, not to worry, because your sleeping position could help you there too. Doctors believed that lying on your side was the best way to protect your backside from unwanted guests. After all, it would be pretty embarrassing if a demon crawled in through your back door, especially since they had the nerve to pick the spot you sat in while sleeping as an indicator of your virtue. The less exposed skin, the better. So, if you wanted to signal that you were modest and pure, you'd want to turn onto your left side while you slept. But perhaps the most universally recommended precaution was avoiding lying flat on your back, whether on purpose or by accident. Not only did it make you vulnerable to demonic invasion, but it was also dangerous for your health. Some doctors even claimed that doing this caused spontaneous human combustion. In all seriousness, though, it was likely the fear of suffocation that inspired these warnings. After all, it would have been pretty hard to argue that someone suffocated in their sleep unless you actually witnessed it happening. You couldn't prove that they died because they were lying on their back. You could just assume that they were sleeping very deeply. So it was easier to say that the person had died because they were lying on their back than to challenge the widespread belief that it was deadly. But why did the demon worry so much about your sleeping position? Well, they were only looking out for themselves. You see, in the Middle Ages, the entire world was considered a battleground between good and evil. Demonic forces were always trying to tempt humans into sin. And what better way to do that than to creep into your mouth and whisper naughty things in your ear? Or, alternatively, crawl into your rectum and mess with your bowels. We don't know exactly what kind of things demons whispered or shouted, but we do know that they tried to distract you from prayer, which was considered the best defense against demonic influence. So, even if you weren't susceptible to temptation, your fellow Christians needed your help. By sleeping upright, you minimize the chances of succumbing to temptation yourself. And then if you happen to wake up without being possessed, you could thank your lucky stars and maybe go back to sleep without any unpleasantness. Between creepy demons and deadly humors, sleeping upright seemed like a smart survival tactic. But whatever your position, get some rest because we've got some new theories about the supernatural world that will blow your mind. A lot of things have been written about the strange sleeping habits of the medieval era. Like they didn't sleep in one long stretch at night like we do today. Instead, they did something called biphasic sleep, which involves sleeping from dusk till about midnight, then waking up for a few hours before going back to sleep till dawn. Now, there are a few theories as to why these people didn't sleep through the night. A 2018 study published in the Journal of Sleep Research suggests that perhaps they were just trying to avoid being eaten by nocturnal predators. But we have no evidence that sleeping arrangements changed in areas where there were no predators. So that theory is kind of dead on arrival. Other historians have suggested that maybe people stopped sleeping in one long stretch because straw mattresses were hard to get in and out of. That makes sense given the chance to sleep on your side or back, who wouldn't take it? But unfortunately, there's no evidence that mattresses really caused people to stop sleeping through the night. Instead, scholars are leaning toward the idea that this biphasic sleep pattern just fit better with the rhythms of life back then. See, there are a few different reasons to think that the medieval period was basically one giant night shift. For starters, candlelight was expensive, and since most candles were made of animal fat, they smelled pretty bad. So people probably didn't want to burn them all night long. Plus, at this time, most people weren't living in buildings with electricity, meaning nighttime was filled with darkness, mystery, and danger. There were no streetlights to illuminate the roads, so walking around at night was risky. And while some homes had glass windows, many didn't. Instead, they had wooden shutters that were designed to keep out not just the elements, but also unwanted guests. In fact, during the Middle Ages, houses were often locked up tight at night, with everyone inside sleeping behind closed doors and heavy wooden trestle beds. With all that said, though, if you wanted to sneak in some quality time with your sweetie after the kids were asleep, having a bed that faced up was ideal. But wait, it gets weirder. Not only did people sleep in an upright position, but their beds were often placed in a corner with the headrest against the wall. This might seem uncomfortable, but the people of the Middle Ages weren't slouches. They knew how to prop themselves up properly. See, most beds were situated at an angle with the head of the bed higher than the foot. And while you might assume that this was for ventilation purposes, that wasn't necessarily the case. Although there's some debate as to why angled beds were so popular, one theory is that the incline helped keep people from falling asleep while sitting up in bed, which may have been an issue considering that some people spent several hours a night engaged in conversation or prayer. And yeah, we know it sounds weird to us today, but at the time, the practice of sitting up in bed was so common that furniture makers started adding headboards to beds, which may have encouraged people to angle their beds even more steeply. In fact, these days, we tend to think of pillows and mattresses as modern conveniences. But back then, people slept on straw mattresses on top of wooden boards or heavy quilts that were stuffed with straw or wool. These were less comfortable than they sound, which is probably why people preferred to sit up in bed rather than lie down. What's more, these materials were expensive, so it made more economic sense to use as little of them as possible. After all, why buy more straw when you can just angle your bed and use the same amount of mattress on top of it? So there you have it. People didn't sleep through the night in the Middle Ages because it was dangerous, smelly, and uncomfortable. Sleeping in an upright position helped them feel safer and gave them more flexibility in their schedules. Plus, it meant they could make better use of their expensive bedding. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go try to nap on a 45-degree angle. Thanks for watching. Pulling on your favorite pair of stretchy pants after a hard day's work, you flop onto your couch and sink into a blissful, if slightly tilted, slumber. Wait, what? Time out. That, my friend, is an outrageously decadent way to spend the night, especially if you lived in the 1300s back then. The position you slept in was less Netflix and chill and more performance art. Now, for the poor, this might mean sleeping curled in a corner or on a bench, often upright because there simply wasn't any room to lie down flat. This could have been true even in the wealthiest households, too, because medieval furniture wasn't designed for sprawling. Benches were the height of luxury, but their hard surfaces weren't meant for lying on. Instead, people sat upright on them during the day and then slumped over them at night to catch some shut-eye. There was no such thing as a mattress or a pillow, so these would-be sleepers would have to make do with whatever blankets or furs they had and maybe, just maybe, a small stack of straw. If you were really lucky, you might be able to afford a low-lying bed with a bit of padding on top, but it probably wouldn't take up much more space than you did when sitting up. And in those circumstances, why bother pretending to lie down? You might as well have stayed put in your upright position and saved yourself the trouble. After all, if you were jostled awake every few minutes by your straw-stuffed lumpy pillow, you might think, hey, I'd rather be sitting. The rich, on the other hand, had canopied beds with curtains and cushions, so it might seem surprising that they too would choose to sleep in an elevated position. But it was considered more civilized to prop yourself up while sleeping, even if it was more difficult to get comfortable that way. Lying flat was seen as something that commoners did, and sitting up showed you were well refined. In fact, the higher you slept, the better. If your bed was raised off the floor, it showed that you had the money to spare for such a luxury. And if your bed was elevated, you could literally raise your head higher than your feet. That way you could sip wine while reclining and look down on everyone else as you drank. Talk about first world problems. So how exactly did these fancy pants nobles prop themselves up? Often with cushions. These would typically be placed behind the person's back and under their head and feet to tilt them upwards. and they wouldn't necessarily be plain blocks of cloth. The wealthier you were, the fancier your cushions might be. They could be made from velvet or silk, filled with feathers or even precious metals like gold or silver. It was also popular to recline while reading books or having your portrait painted. This is a famous one. This painting of Jean de Berry is a great example of this because he is not only lying down, but he's surrounded by all these nice things. He's got his book, he's got his cushions, he's got a dog, he's got a cat. It's like the medieval version of the "I woke up like this" meme. And just as it was important to display wealth while you were awake, it was just as critical to do so while you were asleep. After all, everyone could see what you had while you were awake, but only your bed curtains hid what you were up to once you'd gone to bed. For a nobleman, keeping your curtains drawn all day would have been a sign that you were either sick or dead. So, at night, they would be thrown open to show off your fancy cushions and bedding to anyone who happened to walk by. Perhaps unsurprisingly, therefore. The servants responsible for making up the beds of the elite were expected to arrange everything perfectly before their employers retired for the night. Getting it wrong could result in an unhappy customer, and who wants to deal with a grumpy noble? Not me. As with many things in medieval life, sleep became yet another performance. By day you put on a show of piety, labor, or leisure to those around you. And by night you put on a show of wealth and importance for your neighbors. And if you were really lucky, you might wake up to find that the posture you chose to sleep in elevated you above the commoners, if only in the eyes of your fellow medievalites. So next time you find yourself sinking into the couch cushions, don't disturb the peasants. Just recline, pop some wine, and enjoy the view. Thanks for watching. I've talked a lot about the weird medical fears of the Middle Ages, like the idea that your skeleton could be reabsorbed by your body or that a hair in your eye meant that it was time to harvest the corpses of your friends and family. But there was one fear that permeated every hour of every day for our medieval ancestors, and that was the fear of choking in your sleep. Hi, I'm here to bring you the craziest stories from human history, like this one. Now, we tend to think of choking as something that happens when we're eating, and that's true. Choking was a major concern during the Middle Ages, and you would have been well advised to chew more carefully. But people in those days didn't die only from choking on food. They also died from choking on their own breath. It sounds crazy, but respiratory issues were a fact of life in a smoky, poorly ventilated world. Most homes had open hearths, so by the time the family was ready to go to bed, the room was thick with smoke and soot and dust. You can probably imagine how those tiny airways would fill up with the grime. And that's not even mentioning the dust from the animals that shared the home, along with the sicknesses brought on by cold weather and the miasma of rotting waste. Then there were common colds, which medieval doctors believed attacked the lungs directly. On top of that, there was an illness that modern doctors believe was similar to asthma, and another one that sounded a lot like whooping cough. These breathing problems would often come with phlegm, which would fill up the lungs and make breathing even harder. So people in the Middle Ages were desperate for a good night's sleep, not just for the rest, but because it could literally mean the difference between life and death. And what they discovered was that lying down flat was the fast track to suffocation. The phlegm would fill up their lungs, making it hard to breathe. But then they'd end up swallowing some of that bad boy, which would make things even worse. As the phlegm worked its way through the digestive system, it would block the stomach, and that meant no oxygen could get in or out. It was a one-way street to certain death. Medieval doctors saw firsthand how quickly things could turn deadly. And while we might find some of their ideas about disease pretty laughable today, we should give them credit for one thing: they knew better than to lie down. In the 1300s, a doctor named Guy de Chauliac wrote that you should sleep while sitting up. And he wasn't alone. Across Europe, doctors were telling their patients to do the same thing. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone slept while sitting up any more than it means that everyone followed the advice of their doctors. There's some evidence that wealthy people continued to sleep in the traditional manner, perhaps because they could afford servants to prop them up. But for most people, it was a case of Dr. Lawyer, Indian, hospital. If you wanted to stay alive, you went with the advice of medical professionals. And for once, that advice was very easy to follow. All you had to do was sit up in bed, lean against the headboard, and drift off to sleep. Easy peasy lemon squeezy, right? I don't know about you, but I could never fall asleep sitting up. I'd probably end up watching TV or playing computer games until dawn, and then I wouldn't get any sleep at all. And if my whole routine was disrupted because I was suddenly sitting in bed instead of lying down, I would definitely have some kind of nervous breakdown. No wonder we stopped doing that. If you enjoyed this episode, I've got some more fun facts about the Middle Ages coming up. Just hit subscribe and stay tuned. And if you want to watch an episode where lying down did not mean you de-suffocate to death, try this one about mysterious medieval skeletons that were found buried upside down. Thanks for watching. Sleeping, we all do it, but none of us really know why. Are these mysterious nightly bouts of unconsciousness a holdover from our hunter-gatherer past? A way for our bodies to reset after a day of gathering berries and fending off saber-toothed tigers? Well, maybe. But there's one thing that might have an even bigger impact on how and why we sleep. Demons. Demons, you say. What kind of demons? Well, any kind of demon. In the Middle Ages, demons were everywhere, possessing people, animals, even inanimate objects. And apparently they loved messing with people's sleep. Like if you were sleeping in a particularly vulnerable state, they could suck the breath right out of your body, leaving you dead as a doornail. Or worse, they'd crawl into your body and possess you, turning you into a rabid animal, sometimes for years. So people got pretty serious about protecting themselves against demons, even if it meant sleeping in an upright position. By the late Middle Ages, sleeping in bed was increasingly seen as a risky business. There were lots of theories about how exactly demons managed to attack sleepers. But most had to do with the idea that the body produces bad smells while sleeping, which attracted demons looking for a nice hot corpse to climb inside. So the logical solution was to sleep in a way that minimized those smells. Now, during the day, people would cover their faces with cloths while sleeping, which worked fine for daytime naps. But nighttime sleeping required something sturdier. Hence the rise of the high bedpost. You see, the taller the space between your face and the mattress, the less likely demons could crawl up there and strangle you in your sleep. Plus, the higher your head was elevated, the more air could circulate around your face, preventing the buildup of those pesky bad smells. But the upright position wasn't the only way to beat the demons. Some people also slept propped up on bolsters, basically large pillows that supported your upper body. Bolsters weren't just useful for keeping demons away, though. They were also great for serving meals in bed since they kept food off the floor and away from wandering animals. Plus, they were convenient for reading. In fact, the word bolster originally comes from the Old French word boiler, meaning to boil, which referred to the boiling water that was often carried on bolsters to bed to warm the face and hands. In other words, bolsters were so popular because they allowed people to do things other than sleep in bed, like eating, reading, and drinking tea. In the 15th century, people even started making special tea sets just for bedtime. The custom caught on quickly. By the 1620s, it was common for young women to be presented with special bed-based tea sets upon their marriage, an expected part of any well-to-do household. By the 1700s. The upright bed and bolster became less popular once people started lying down again. But the association of beds with eating and reading persisted long after the demon panic died out. That's why even today we talk about sitting in bed with tea and books. It's also why hospital beds have raised sections at the head and foot. When you prop yourself up like that, you're following a tradition that stretches back hundreds of years. In the end, sleeping like an upright owl may seem weird to us now. But it was just a sensible precaution for people living in a time when illness and death stalked them at every turn. For their part, demons probably got tired of being blamed for everything that went bump in the night and eventually slunk back into the shadows. Or maybe they just moved on to haunting teenagers instead. So the next time you lie down in bed, take a second to appreciate modern conveniences like bug nets, allergy-proof covers, and most importantly, mental health professionals who don't blame everything on demons. Sleep tight and don't let the bedbugs bite, or the demons, for that matter. At Minute Earth, we love digging into the data. That That's why we so excited to be partnering with Brilliant, whose mission is to help you learn math and science interactively. You can learn at your own pace, on your own schedule, and at your own level. All you need is a device with an internet connection. With the course, Math for Problem Solving, you can brush up on your logic and reasoning skills and tackle problems with confidence. This course is designed for everyone, even those without a math background. You'll explore real-world applications of math and see how it can be used to understand the world around you.